Hello, everybody. I am assuming we are now live. It looks good. Welcome to the Time Block Academy. I am pleased that you are all here today. I am pleased that you all have purchased the Long Fable Time Block Planner. I'm hoping you are enjoying it so far. It has been at least a month since I've been using mine, and I have been really enjoying it. And before I talk about today's program, let me just briefly give some thanks to Portfolio Books who helped put this event together. I know, for example, Mary Kate is here among the participants. She, along with Lillian, tirelessly answered your emails as you signed up for this event and helped set up this tech. So thank you to them and everyone else who was involved from Portfolio in bringing this together. I know it was not an easy lift. So here's my thought for today. The main idea is that we're going to do questions. And I'm going to take questions from the audience using the Q&A panel that I'm looking at here, and I can see Q&A questions are already going. Note that's different than the chat. So you actually want to click the thing that says Q&A to use the Q&A panel. I also have here some questions that were sent in ahead of time from those who pre-ordered the book but could not actually attend the event tonight. We can talk time blocking. We can talk productivity in general. Maybe we'll even do a few more broader questions. If I feel like I'm in the mood, we'll basically handle it like a live episode of Deep Questions with a particular focus on productivity geekery. Before we get going with that, however, I wanted to give a brief backstory on the planner. In particular, how did I come to think that this was something that was worth pursuing? And there was really two things that were relevant to my mind I thought I would briefly share. The first is I wanted it. I have been time blocking, but also the broader productivity system that surrounds my time blocking, the broader capture, configure, control system that involves things like weekly planning and metrics. This whole system I had been hacking generic notebooks to use for years. I'd been using, as longtime readers on my blog knows, black and red notebooks to do my time block planning. The daily page format where you have two pages facing you, that actually came from my use of black and red notebooks. But I was somewhat frustrated with the lack of built-in bookmark, and then they changed their paper quality. I did not like the new paper quality. It got more glossy and didn't handle the ink as well as the old paper quality. Then for my metric tracking ritual, I could track those in the black and red, but just a box drawn on there ad hoc didn't feel official enough. And so I was using a separate Moleskine style weekly calendar to do my metric tracking. So I had multiple notebooks that I was using. And it occurred to me that what if I had everything I needed in one notebook? I might be actually in a position to make something like that happen. And so this is, in some sense, my dream of what I wanted in my own life to get the most out of my system. The right pages, pre-formatted, no hacking, good paper, built-in ribbon, daily pages right there, metric tracking right there, a box that says shutdown complete, so I no longer have to say that out loud, even though that would end the amusement that my family gets from it. And the planner that we put together was that dream instantiated. The other reason, however, this seemed important to me is that something I have learned working with productivity, working with the psychology of trying to get things done, is that it's not enough to just know, here's a good approach to organizing yourself. Here's a good philosophy for getting after your work. And knowing the information is not enough. There's a hurdle you have to go over, which is actually implementing these systems. And for whatever reason, humans like to have some sort of self-signal, something they've made a non-trivial investment of time, attention, or in this case, maybe a little bit of money to have an actual artifact they can hold that signals to themselves, oh, I'm a time blocker. Now, again, if we look at this completely rationally, you say, well, I don't get why that's necessary. You could just do the method with any notebook you want. But when you actually have this thing in your hand that's dedicated to doing exactly this system, when you know it's something that you bought and you had shipped to you and you have here in your hands, for whatever reason, you're much more likely to do it. And I think it has a lot to do with self-identity. you think of yourself as someone who does time blocking because you're someone who owns a time block planner. And that might seem trite, but I think it's actually effective for a lot of people. And people are more likely to stick with the system, especially if the artifact itself is useful and convenient and aesthetically pleasing. And so I also saw this planner as a way of actually helping many more people get into this type of discipline. Now, we planned this, have been working on this for a long time. The origins go way before, let's say, the pandemic, but I think it is well suited for our current moment as people all over the world find themselves with their time under pressure, with stresses they didn't have before, maybe trying to coordinate a schedule with a partner, trying to balance childcare in there, finding the email, Zoom, these things that pull at their time have doubled or quadrupled in how much they're trying to pull at your time and attention. And it really never has been more important, probably, to have control over your time. The list reactive approach of let's just open up our inbox and rock and roll in between meetings, that might work in a slower period where you're at your office and you have a lot of downtime. It's not working now. And so I think time blocking couldn't have come at a more fortuitous moment. So that's why I wrote this planner. I'm excited that it's here. I'm excited that it's out. I'm excited that you have it. But I want to open up the Academy now and let's do some questions. All right, so we got 65 questions here in the Q&A. Let's see here. Hello, that's a good question. Not seeing the gallery view option, that's from before. That's from before we turned it on. All right, let's see what we got here. All right, so we have a question here from David. And David asks, one of the biggest challenges that I face with my time blocking is underestimation of the time required to complete a task. When the time runs out, I now need to rebuild my whole schedule. How can one improve accuracy in projecting time required? Overallocating time seems to help a bit. It's been easier to add something to my schedule when I have found time than it has been to take something away that I internally committed to, but this does seem a bit inefficient and may require saying no to requests from other people. Well, David, this is one of the number one issues with beginner time blockers. It's one of the first skills you have to build up. Having an issue with not allocating enough time for tasks when you're new to time blocking is like having an issue with running out of breath when you are new to jogging. Yeah, until you actually build up the lung capacity, you're not going to get very far. The optimistic part of this analogy, though, is that it's very trainable and it's something that you can get better at. So a few things that are useful. One, you might want to consider increasing the granularity of your blocks early on. So resist the urge to have very small blocks, like half-hour blocks or less. I never recommend going below 30-minute blocks, but even 30-minute blocks are kind of an expert move. You're really getting kind of fine-tuned. So you might have multi-hour blocks where you're being a little bit more vague about what you're actually trying to execute in the block. So individual administrative procedures might fall into a very large admin block, for example. Deeper work efforts, instead of being completely pulled out, like I'm working exactly on this report for this hour, it might be a few hours of, try to make progress on the, such and such conference, which is coming up. Now, when you're being this vague at first, you're not getting the full power out of time blocking, but what you're doing is setting up a schedule that you're actually going to be able to hit. And you really want to get that experience up front. Like I really am hitting my schedule. Because if you're constantly breaking your schedule a lot early on, you're going to lose the habit. So I think it's more important early on that you're doing rough granularity schedules that you hit, and then you can come back in and try to increase the granularity as you get a little bit better at estimating how long things take. A couple other pieces of advice: use conditional blocks. I talk about this a lot. Talk about it in the intro to the planner. I talk about it on my podcast. I think in yesterday's episode, I talked about this on Deep Questions. Conditional blocks are where you put aside what you think is a conservative guess for how long it's going to take to accomplish something. And then you add another block of time after that, non-trivial length block of time. And basically what you do with this block is say, if the preceding initiative is taking longer than I think, that's what this block can be about. But if I finish it, then here is the fallback task I would do instead. Something that's not urgent, but would be useful to make progress on. Similarly, if you get halfway through the conditional block, let's say, and then you finish the preceding task, that secondary task you use to fill the remaining half of the time. So conditional blocks are good because basically you don't have to break your schedule, even if your estimation of these sort of larger initiatives falls a little bit short. And where you do guess well, you've given some intention to what you want to do, so it doesn't just become extra time. You're not deciding on the fly what do I want to do next. But when you don't guess right, the schedule is still preserved. So I would recommend those as well. You might want to throw some buffers into your schedule too, where it's a half hour here, an hour here, where you just call it buffer. And look, if you get there and you finished everything up to that buffer, then you can go for a walk or something like that, just to give yourselves a little bit of breathing room in the schedule. It's fine to have to rebuild your schedules. You should expect it, but we want to make sure early on that you're not having to do this more than a few times a day. All right, let's look for another question here. Let me just check this too. All right, so we have a question here from, let's see here. Let's do the question here from Deep T. Says, hi, I'm new to time blocking, but have been loving it for the short time I've been doing it. How does the time block planner fit into a bigger system for annual and quarterly planning? Well, that's a good question. I'm a big believer I do 3 scales of planning. I do daily, I do weekly, and I do quarterly. Not so much annually, though I'll put a pin in that for a second, but I do quarterly. Quarterly is actually the business term. I actually do semester, if I'm going to be really honest, because I'm an academic. So I think of the fall, the spring, and the summer as the main units of time. But most people in the professional world are more familiar with quarter. So I use the term quarterly. The time block planner is useful for the first 2 scales. For daily planning, you should do your daily planning with time blocks. You do those time blocks on the daily pages. You have what you need in the planner. For the weekly scale, you have weekly pages in the time block planner where you can work out your plan for the current week. It's right there in the planner. You can reference it when you need it. For the quarterly planning, that's outside of the scope of the planner. That's where you're really figuring out, okay, what's important to me? What big initiatives do I want to make progress on during this quarter to get closer to the things that are important to me? Your quarterly plan is what you should reference when making your weekly plan. Your weekly plan should look at that quarterly plan to be like, okay, where am I on these big initiatives? What type of things do I have to keep in mind when scheduling my days this week? So where do you store a quarterly plan? It's up to you. It's up to you. I use Google Drive. I actually have, as my podcast listeners know, 2 documents, one for my plan for my professional life, one for my plan for my life outside of work. I have a folder in my Google Drive account called Core, a reference to the rooted productivity, the core of my productivity systems. Those documents are in there. It doesn't matter how you do it. You can do it in a separate notebook. You can do it on a computer in a special file. The format doesn't matter, whatever technology you like. The reason why I don't care so much about the format or technology for quarterly is that it's not something that you're touching regularly. It's not something where friction is going to be a problem. It's not something where, well, I have to look at this 5 times a day. And if there's a little bit of friction, then maybe I'll stop doing it. It's something you look at more rarely. All right, let's see what other questions we have here. All right, so Elizabeth asked, what are the downsides of using the planner for work and life rather than only work tasks? Well, Elizabeth, I think the planner is relevant to your life outside of work. My main recommendation along these lines, however, is don't time block your time outside of work. So don't time block your evenings, don't time block your weekends. Now, the reason I say this is because time blocking, when you're actually executing a time block schedule, it's intense. There's this constant pressure of I have to hit the block. And if your estimations are a little tight, there's a little bit of stress that could come from it too. Like I'm running out of time, I've fallen a little bit behind. There is a pressure to time block planning. Now, that pressure is part of what makes it incredibly effective from an output perspective. It means when you're working, you're working. You're doing, as I talk about in deep work, Teddy Roosevelt style, intense dashes where you're locked in. I want to do this. This is what I'm doing. You're resisting distraction. You're trying to hit your marks. This is a big part of the reason why time block planners tend to get something like 2x more done per week than people who don't time block plan. But if you're doing this all the time, it's draining. If you're time blocking your evenings and you're time blocking your weekends, you are constantly going to feel like you're under a state of time stress. And I think over time, that is going to lead to burnout. So I don't recommend time blocking evenings or weekends, but there are other things the planner offers that is relevant. One obvious thing is the metric tracking. I'm a big believer in tracking metrics. I think just knowing that you're going to be tracking a metric, you're more likely to participate or undertake the behavior that you know is useful, and also gives you actionable data on what's going on in your life, where things are good, where things are bad, progress you're making on things you care about. Now, here's the thing about metric tracking. Those don't have to just be professional. Now, I'll tell you that the majority of the metrics I actually track in the metric tracking space are not professional related. Let me grab my planner here. All right, so I'm grabbing my planner. And all right, let me go to today. Well, I don't have my yesterday. All right, so I'm looking at yesterday. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. I have 11 metrics I'm tracking right now. That's kind of a lot. I will admit I'm sort of in a mode right now where I'm kind of really optimizing, sort of a busy demanding time for me. And so I use my metrics to try to keep my life in a value driven, sort of meaningful structure. So even as the difficulties of the individual days come and go, that I am grounded. But I'm looking at 11 metrics, and most are not professional. Let's see here. Three are. So my deep work tally, that's professional. I track when I shut down. It's not really professional. Actually, I do that because I'm trying to bring that time even earlier, because I'm trying to free up more time for the family. So it's kind of professional, but really it's not for professional. I have this to-do metric I track. So it's to-do : and then hash mark. So every time I do a full sweep of all of my captured tasks and my plan, that counts as a to-do. And what I want to keep track of is that I do it twice a day. So the whole point of that metric is that I have a tendency to be like, well, I know what I need to do today. I want to just get started. But it leads to more stress down the line if you're not consistently actually looking at all the things on your plate and making sure there are no open loops. My brain doesn't like it. So I actually force myself twice on weekdays, and once every weekend I have to sweep the system. That's probably relevant. I have a chapter count in here. I mean, a lot of everything I read is kind of relevant to my work as well. So that's relevant. But then the other things, not to open the kimono too much, there's like a social related thing, a kid related thing, a gratitude related thing, a news related thing. I'm severely cutting down the amount of time I'm allowed to look at news. I talked about this on the podcast. I don't look at stuff online. I started looking at things online for the election. I don't know how you guys do that. Those of you who look at the internet all the time, I don't know how you do it. Completely fried me. And so now I have to use metrics to get that down to an incredible bare minimum, because a complete brain fryer. And I can't imagine that actually being the state that you're in all the time. But I think it's the state a lot of people are in all the time, not to divert here, where it's constantly back and forth. What's on my phone, what's on the screen, what's on my work. And just my brief experience doing that with election news taught me the cognitive context switching costs are absurd. I can't work that way. So I have to use metrics to keep myself now grounded. All right, that whole thing is a bit of a diversion, but to get back to the point, which itself was only one point of my answer to the original question, the metrics are very useful for stuff unrelated to work. The other thing I'm going to say I do with my time blocker is I don't block my time in the evening. But what I normally do is put a list. So my time block will go down. I don't usually take up the whole rows. And I'll list out in the space that remains just some notes about, remember we're doing this evening, or get this done, or we need to catch up. Because I look at my to-dos and everything right at the end of the day before I do shutdown complete. And so I write down there what I discovered that's relevant. Like, here's things I need to do tonight. And I just jot them down. I don't block when I'm going to do them, but I jot them down. And so after my shutdown complete, I really don't have to go back and look at any list, including my my household list. All right. So long answer to a short question, but a good one. The planner is useful for life outside of work. Just don't time block all of your time outside of work. All right. Let's see here. Scroll a little bit here for fairness. All right. Ryan asks, how do you get a boss on board with this work philosophy? Can I send him the recording of this webinar? Yeah, well, it's an interesting question. So how do you get a boss on board? Well, if we're talking about time blocking in particular, this is just something you can do. I mean, your boss doesn't need to know or care. I think what your boss will notice is you're getting a lot more done, but it's just something that you can kind of do. The main thing I would say that in a knowledge work office environment that people notice when someone switches to time blocking is that their email replies get more batched. Time blockers block off email times. And I always say, hey, if you say, what, in my company, I have to check my email, 20 times, it's like, great, then you're going to have 20 blocks on your time block calendar, but face up to it. Don't pretend like you're not spending that time. So that's the main thing people notice is, oh, you don't respond to my emails right away. But time blockers put aside time for emails and they do a shutdown at the end of the day. So things don't get dropped. You do eventually get to the email. You do eventually get back. And so you have this brief transition period where at first people are worried, are you going to answer? Did you get this? And then they learn, Ryan, doesn't drop the ball. He does get back to me. It's always not right away, but he always gets back to me. He follows up on things. He delivers things when he said he does. Time blocking gets you there. And then you earn, in some sense, what Adam Grant calls the idiosyncrasy credits that allow you to sort of get away with that. So that's the main thing people notice. If someone asks, you can tell them about your system. I generally recommend that you don't, without prompting, explain to people, this is how I'm working now. Because what tends to happen is that just highlights to people in the moment the negative things. All they hear when you say, look, here's how I'm working now, all they hear is, here are the ways where I'm going to inconvenience you more. All right, I'm not going to answer your emails all the way, blah, blah, blah. They don't care about your explanation. They just care what you're telling me, that you're going to do things that's going to make my life harder. And then you're going to get pushback like, oh, I don't know about this. I'm not sure about this. I think I want you on your inbox or whatever. So I just say, just rock and roll. People aren't going to notice much. They might just notice the email issue. Now, the broader question of how do you convince your boss to rework their office altogether? Well, you can give them a copy of Deep Work. And if you can wait until March, give them a copy of my upcoming book, A World Without Email, because that really gets into future of work, why the way we're working now is broken, how we're going to fix it in the future. And I'm sort of hoping that there will be a lot of people in your situation around the world once that book comes out that are just sort of handing this book towards their boss and then slowly backing out of the room and hoping that it actually takes. All right. I have some of these pre-recorded questions, but there's good ones coming in here on the Q&A. So I'm just rolling now with what we have. And I'm just checking a quick glance at the chat. All right. Bill asks a more general productivity question. Do you have master list for projects, ideas, and tasks? And how do you use that in tandem with the time block approach? All three of those things are different. I have places for all three of those. All three of those places are different. So tasks I keep in Trello. In general, and I talked about this on my podcast, in general, when it comes to the middle part of my productivity philosophy, and for those who don't know, who don't listen to the podcast, we talk a lot about capture, configure, control. Capture is making sure that things you need to do are captured and they're not in your brain. You trust where they're going. This is classic David Allen getting things done. Control, on the other side, is you actually control your time. You intentionally allocate your time and attention to get the most out of it. So that's exactly what this planner does for you. Time block planning, weekly planning gets you there. The planner also helps with capture because you do have a space for capture right there. Though there's other incoming streams where things are going to have to be captured, like into email inboxes or Slack channels. So it's not like the planner is the only place that captures, but it helps you with that. The configure, though, is what do you do with all the things you need to do? How do you make sense of them and organize them and reorganize them and prune them and clarify them? And I use Trello for this purpose. Any sort of virtual task board software will get you to the same place, but I like the visual metaphor of cards being stacked in columns, which is the metaphor of Trello. And then furthermore, these columns all add up to a board. So you can have multiple boards. So for my task, I actually have different boards for different roles in my life. I think of my different professional roles as a sort of a self-contained, I don't know, productivity context. So like I have a board for the research I do as a professor. That's a separate board than I have for what I call class plus admin, Georgetown class plus admin, which is like class related stuff and just, administrative stuff associated with being an employee of the university. And then I have a completely separate third board for writing related work, because I see those as different contexts. And in each board, I have columns. The columns correspond to the status of the cards underneath them, and the cards correspond to things that need to be done. And having statuses makes all the difference to me. For example, one key status I use is waiting to hear back. It's critical to have this. Most people don't, but okay, I'm waiting to hear back from this person on this issue. To have a place where you have a card that says that, so you don't have to keep it in your head. You don't have to worry about it. And you can very efficiently, when you're going through your cards, be like, okay, oh yeah, let me follow up with this person. It's been a little while. That's very useful. I have a whole column that's often, I don't know what I call it different things, but basically I don't really know what this means yet. I just know, this is where you have something vague and you're like, I know I need to make progress. Like, okay, we had an initial conversation of like, we should do the Time Block Academy, but we haven't done anything else yet. I might just have something in there like Time Block Academy. And it's I call it often like to be processed or ambiguous. And it's like, okay, the actual task represented by this card is to look at this vague task and make it more concrete. I have back burners. This is what I'm working on this week. Sometimes I'll have different columns for like things that are kind of urgent, but split up by category. Anyways, it really matters to have your task actually seen with status, context, and split up between roles. That compared to just a massively long list of everything is much, much better. It feels tractable. You can get the gestalt of your productivity state very quickly in a way that just looking at a massive combined list, you can't. So I use software for that. I use Trello. There's other tools I like. I've talked about Workflowy. That's another good one I like, workflowy.com. Okay, so ideas I use Evernote. And so this is book ideas and article ideas, and that all goes in there. Research ideas, ideas related to the sort of media business aspect of my writing career, the podcasting, the videos and stuff like that. That has its own notebook. That all ends up in Evernote. You'll notice that the Time Block Planner has a capture for ideas on every single day, so that if those come to you while you're working on a block, you can just jot it down without having to go on your computer and to go into Evernote or whatever you use. You can copy it there in the moment and get back to your block. And then later when you do your shutdown, you can copy it into the system. And then plans, as I mentioned earlier, well, you said projects, but my projects, what are the big picture projects I'm working on? That's going to be in this quarterly level plans, which I actually call the documents I call strategic plans, but that'll actually be in my strategic plan for work. It'll be like, okay, in writing, here's what's going on this fall. My research, this is what's going on this fall. And not only do I list it there, but I have some high level discussion of what does that mean? Like, what are the milestones? How much work do I need to be doing? How do I imagine getting where I want to get for this article, getting where I want to get on this research paper, getting where I want to get on, like, let's say launching, a new podcast or something like that. What do I actually have to do, and how's that going to work? And is there going to be one weekend when I do it, or I need to do one day every week and start the morning? I actually do some conceiving right there at that level about how I get the projects done. So 3 different systems for those 3 different types of things. All right. Again, long answer to short questions. This is the issue with asking me about productivity. I can talk endlessly. All right, so Patrick, a brief question. Why do we do 7 days instead of 5 with the weekly pages, even though I don't typically recommend time blocking on the weekends? Because it could go either way. I felt like it would be, when I do my weekends, I still have a lot of capture going on, for example. And so I felt like having capture pages for each weekend would be important. I don't recommend time blocking weekends necessarily, but some people, if you have a schedule, like, okay, especially those with kids know about this. I got to get this kid here. I got to go pick this up. Some people like to sketch out the things they have to do, the things that are on their calendar, putting it onto the time block page so that they don't have to use their computer, right? As we're on our screen so much, I think it's nice to be able to just, okay, here's my Saturday page, and I can see we got to go to the doctor's here, and then we're going to see these here. We got to run this errand here, and I kind of see when we're doing it, so I see the plan without having to go on my computer. As I think about work things during the day, I can just jot them down in the planner, and then you have the shutdown block, and you don't have to shut down like for Saturday on Saturday night. The nice thing about the shutdown checkboxes is if you miss some shutdowns, you know exactly what days you haven't shut down because they're not checked. So you just go back to the first unchecked checkbox and start processing everything you have. So it's not an uncommon thing on the weekend that you're kind of capturing things on Saturday and Sunday and drawing out your calendar, and maybe not till Monday morning do you go back and actually take the things you captured and move them into your systems, at which point you do check the shutdown checkbox. All right. I'm scrolling ahead a little more aggressively to get some of the later questions too. All right. So Michael, who's a graduate student, asked, when do you know that it's time to shut down? Well, the tautological answer, Michael, is you know it's time to shut down because you're at the end of your last block in the time block schedule. So once you're done with the stuff you have scheduled, you're done. So of course, the deeper question is, well, how much work should you schedule on the time block schedule? And that's a more complex question. I, for example, semi-famously do not like to work past roughly 5 p.m. on weekdays. And for the most part, not on weekends. I always give the exceptions being I typically write my weekly blog posts in the evening. And if I have a conference deadline, I will work on the weekends. And book writing, I'll often write in the weekend mornings, or if I have an article deadline for like a big complex piece, like a New Yorker piece or something, I'll write on the weekends. But I work backwards from wanting to shut down at 5, and time blocking helps me get there. Other people have different schedules. The key is just intentionality, that you are looking at your schedule and saying, I think this is the best use of my day. And I think this is the right balance between work and non-work. And if you find yourself, for example, having to schedule hour after hour after hour, you're scheduling your evening hours away and you still can't keep up with work, well, at least you have a clear record that there is a work overload problem. You're not avoiding it. You're seeing it in black and white on your time block planner. So there is no right answer of how much work you should or shouldn't do, but you should be intentional about it. And a time block planner forces you to do so. So Maximilian's asking about a checklist for the shutdown ritual. Yeah, I mean, it's not a bad idea. Like, the idea would be that when you do the shutdown ritual, instead of just checking off shutdown complete, there's actually the elements of the shutdown ritual that you check off as well. It's not a bad idea, but not everyone's shutdown ritual is the same. And so I did not, flexibility, you'll notice, permeates this planner. I am not a fan of planners that try to impose sort of too much control over like the decisions of what you do or the decisions of what activities you do. I'm not a big fan of planner approaches where there's various prompts and questions and charts you fill out that are the sort of mechanistic idea that you answer these things and it will tell you this is what you should be working on. I just think it's intuitive and it's complex, and there's a lot of other systems and input and information involved in figuring out what you should do. And I don't think the planner can figure that out for you. So my planner is very flexible, and more broadly than my planning, time blocking is very flexible. It's like, I'm not going to tell you what to do. It's going to help you get the most out of the time you have. It's a time allocation device. And so not putting a checklist for the shutdown is within the character of that decision. Different people do it different ways. The reality, Maximilian, is you do this for a couple of weeks, the ritual becomes incredibly ingrained. Like when it's time to do the shutdown ritual, it's like boom, 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 check. And so you're probably not missing much. All right, let's see here. Chuck asked, when you capture a task or idea, when do you process it and where do you store it for future days? All right, so if I'm in the middle of working on a time block, That's what the task and ideas columns are for on the capture page, which is across from your time block grid for every day. I'll capture it there in the notebook. During the shutdown ritual is when I'll typically transfer it into my permanent systems. And as I talked about, ideas go to Evernote, tasks go to Trello. Philip says, after COVID, will you offer an in-person intensive for people who are really difficult cases? Well, Philip, there's probably more scalable ways for me to get more intensive on training than actually working with a small group of people. Though I will say I do miss being in front of people. I I don't miss travel. I don't miss commuting to Georgetown, but I did not realize the degree to which I spend a lot of my time in front of people, be it my students at Georgetown, or speaking. I mean, I've probably done recently maybe half a dozen virtual speaking events, all of which would have been in person. And so I'm just thinking about all the places I've been. The travel would be a headache, but I do miss seeing people. So I don't know, Philip, if I get particularly disconnected and lonely by the time the pandemic ends, then who knows? Maybe I'll be out on the street corner trying to recruit people into impromptu productivity classes just for the human contact. So we'll see how bad it gets. All right. So an anonymous question: why not, since the planner covers 13 weeks, which is roughly a quarter, why not include pages for a quarterly plan? I thought about it. I thought about it. The reason why I didn't is my quarterly plans are voluminous, and uh, it would be a lot of handwriting, and I would probably need a lot of pages. Your quarterly plan might not be so voluminous, but because I have a bunch of different roles, sort of like the standing joke on my podcast is my 72 jobs, but I have a lot of different roles, and it's sort of complicated to plan for it. I mean, there's um, like I was just looking at it, earlier, but even just within like Georgetown, I have three major academic directions, each of which is producing its own sequential stream of papers. And I'm trying to figure that out and juggle that, each with its own set of collaborators. And there's detailed planning for that. I have detailed planning for writing. I have a lot of article writing queued up, and actually I have two parallel tracks of articles that are queued up in two different topic areas. There's a lot of like, okay, what's going on? What is this queue? What's going on with the things at the top of the queue? What needs to happen this quarter? I'm thinking book. I'm not writing a new book yet, but I'm working on a new book in my head. So like there's work going on with that's happening, and there's a ton of stuff around the sort of media aspect of my career, the podcast, growing the podcast, the video stuff, the courses, the courses I do with Scott, like the life, we just launched Life of Focus. There's a huge amount of planning that goes into that. All of that gets like relatively discursive expository text in my quarterly plan. And I have bad handwriting and I write slow. And so I was just imagining trying to rewrite and, write that all out. And, I figured I'll leave quarterly plans flexible. You can use whatever technology is relevant, and it allows for more flexibility there. But that's a judgment call. And what I'm doing, I'm just jumping to the bottom briefly to see if there's follow-up questions and stuff we talked about recently, and then I'll go back up a little bit. All right. Someone's asking, okay, what would be, so Hesham's asking, what would be your recommendations for getting to the habit of time blocking? I've been doing it for years, but sometimes I fall off for extended periods. Well, Hesham, this is going to sound like a self-serving answer, but having a thing that's for time blocking that's around, that really matters, right? I keep this it comes with me, and then it goes to my dresser. And I do my metro recording at the end of the day. So it goes to my dresser near my bed. Just seeing the thing. Then you're like, okay, I didn't do it yesterday, but all I need to do it today is just pick that up and, have a good pin. I mentioned I've been liking these, I was a Uniball micro guy. I've been liking these Pilot pins that have the little metal nib that comes out, the long metal nib, and then a liquid ink ball precision. I think it's a 0.7 millimeter. Good pin, you have it. All you have to do is pick it up and you can rock and roll. You've gotten rid of all the friction. It matters, right? So just having the planner around, I think helps. I think it's going to help you from not falling out of the habit. Take the time to do good weekly plans. It makes the time blocking for the rest of the week go a lot easier. It feels like a waste because it takes an hour or whatever, and you're like, I could get working, but it's almost always worth it. If you really have a hard time with it, do the weekly planning at the end of the day, Friday or Sunday night, before, so you can hit the ground running on Monday if that makes you if that actually makes you feel better. And then get into the habit of metric tracking. Track simple things, but useful things. But in the habit of metric tracking, that's a keystone habit you can really get in the habit of doing. And then once you have that as a keystone habit, it will pull time blocking along with it because that metric box is right there next to your time block schedule. I can tell you metric tracking, like really simple things like having a little exercise routine you can do in 5 minutes just to move the major muscle groups, a step counter. I always like to show this off. I'm not around people anymore. I don't trust Fitbits. I don't trust Apple Watches. I don't want those people tracking my information. So I am a big believer of the 3D Trisport. Amazon.com runs off of a watch battery. It has a grayscale LCD screen. All it does is track your steps, and at midnight it resets, and it stores the days before. What were yesterday's steps? How many steps have I taken today? No one is tracking this. This thing does not have the ability to send messages to Apple. It does not have the ability to sync up with a social media account. It just tells me that I've taken 6,628 steps so far today. So like you get simple things you track, but that are positive. That is a very easy keystone habit to make semi-addictive. It's a very easy habit that you can hack your psychology into, like, I just do this all the time and I feel bad if I don't. And then that will bring the time blocking with it, because that metric tracking space is right next to the time block grid. And when that's blank, you don't feel good about it. And so then you'll be more likely to do it. All right. Oh, here's a good technical question. So Gina is asking, I am confused with your transfer process of tasks. Can you clarify how you distinguish which tasks go to Trello and which goes to your time block, or do you do both? All right, Gina, that's a good question. So your time block plan is just a plan for what you want to do during a given day. And when you make that plan, you might then label it with, I'm going to work on these tasks during this block or something like this. But it's not a storage system for your plan, for your task. You should have a third-party storage system, long-term storage system for your tasks. Now, your planner can capture them. If they come up when you're in the middle of a time block, you have capture pages, you can temporarily capture them. But by the end of the day, you want to get them out of the capture pages in your planner and into whatever long-term system you use. To be part of your shutdown complete ritual is that everything you captured, you wrote down in the capture pages on the fly, gets moved into a permanent system. The next day, when you build a time block plan for that next day, you look at your permanent task system when trying to figure out how to build that time block plan. You look at your weekly plan when you're trying to figure out how to build that time block plan. You look at your calendar, which is a completely separate system as well, when you build that time block plan, to make sure that all of your meetings and appointments are in there where they actually go. So your time block plan brings in information from all sorts of different systems and sources to construct a good plan for the day. And you do list for your day, okay, if I'm going to do these tasks, you're going to list those tasks as part of your time block plan. But it's not like they live in your plan. It's just a reminder to you of, this is what I'm trying to do during this day. So someone asked, they said their company blocks software like Trello. Have you had success with other tools? Yeah, you can use whatever. I'm not, you can use paper if you want. You can have an actual task board. But there's a lot of other tools. I think Microsoft, there's a ton of competitors to Trello. I think Microsoft owns one of them. Maybe Flow. I'm not quite sure. The chat can probably figure this out. I think Flow Microsoft might have bought Flow. That's the same thing. Workflowy, they probably don't block because they don't know about it. But that's not actually columns and lists, but it's like indented lists, and you can kind of simulate the same thing. So yeah, whatever works. I'm not a big believer. I'm not a big believer that the detail, especially with tasks and task storage, that there's any magic in the system itself that's going to somehow like help you get more done or figure out what to do. I mean, ultimately, it's information storage and organization that needs to be useful. I get into a lot of this in the new book, by the way. I call it the Taskboard Revolution. I'm a big believer in task boards, not just for personal tasks, but for organizing whole teams. And I think it's the key to a lot of issues in the workplace right now. So if you're intrigued by task boards, I go a little overboard on that topic in the upcoming book. All right, let's see what else we have here. ZZ asked, how does your mobile phone play a role in your productivity? And do you use it as a tool in time blocking? It plays no role, and no, I don't use it as a tool in time blocking. My mobile phone is for books on tape and podcast. It's also, when I get lost, I need the map, and it's how my wife texts me. All right, let's see what else we have here. So Abdullah asks, are we just playing mental games with our brain to try to get things done? And I would say it's not mental games. It's an optimization problem. And we're used to thinking about other types of work in that way. We think about other types of work, let's say like industrial manufacturing. What's the process? How do we get this done? How much resources do we need? How do we know how much resources to order? How do we organize the assembly? Do we do it in a continuous line? Do we have stations? Like, we think a lot. We have resources. We want to produce value. What's the best way to do this? What's the right processes? We don't think that way enough when it comes to mental work, the type of stuff we do if we sit in an office and we look at a computer screen, but it's just as important. We have all these resources, which is usually information, especially in the knowledge work context, and we need to run it through our brains. We need to coordinate with other people who are running it through their brains. We need to produce output, which tends to be knowledge or informational on the other end. That has more value than the raw information, and that's where the value comes from to keep the organization profitable or afloat. So what's the right way to actually just take, this is the manufacturing equipment. What's the right way to actually deploy this manufacturing equipment? And we don't think enough about it. Time blocking is a part of that answer. We have so much time and attention to actually sit and look at what we want to do with it during the day, what's going to be the optimal way to allocate it. It's really not that different than thinking about like, how do we organize the tools? How do we organize the robots that help assemble different parts of the car? It's the same type of thinking. We're just not used to thinking that way about our own brain. So now I don't think about it as games. I think about it as it is non-obvious. It is non-obvious a priori what's the best way to actually do cognitive work. And so time block planning is like a tool to help do that more effectively. All right, so Carolyn asked a question relevant to a lot of people right now. How do you adjust time blocking around an erratic period? Right now, I'm trying to complete a major project around our grandbaby who's 2 days old. My goodness. I'm caring for everyone and trying not to lose blocking all together. Well, I mean, Carolyn, I think there's two different answers to that. So there's one answer is sometimes you're essentially in what you can think of as weekend mode. And what I mean by weekend mode is like it's not a day you're time blocking, right? You're not time blocking your Saturday, but you know that at 2 you need to go pick up the whatever from the store, right? So there's certain rocks that get dropped into the day, but you're otherwise not trying to time block all of your time. Like, that's how I recommend dealing with non-work time. You're not trying to strictly organize everything, but you want to keep track of what the big rocks are. You might be in that mode right now. I mean, if you have there's a baby at home and it is unpredictable and you need to help in different ways that you can't really plan, you might be in a place where like, let me just get some big rocks in here. I'm going to be gone. You know, you're talking to your daughter, you're talking to your son. I'm going to be gone for these 3 hours and incredibly intensely going to be working on this big thing I need to do. Or I have I put aside an hour where I organized ahead. Like, here's all these tasks I need to get done. And I've sorted them in the most efficient possible way. And it's like full out intensity during that time. And then outside of those big rocks, we're just going to have to be flexible, right? It's Saturday mode. We're not trying to plan every minute. That's that might be the mode that you're in right now. If it's not quite so hectic, if it's more, you're basically working, but there's these unpredictable interruptions that are non-trivial, not enough to like completely throw out like 3 hours long, but like there's unpredictable interruptions, but you otherwise need to basically be doing like something like a normal work day. Then you just need to add, I would say more, have less granularity in your blocks, bigger blocks, more conditional blocks, more buffers. You're just gonna have to put a lot more flexibility so that uh, one or two interruptions is not going to actually blow up the block schedule. All right, what we got here? Got about 9 minutes left. All right, so when I go the last 9 minutes, I'll try to go a little bit broader here. Actually, a little broader questions. Let's see what Louise has to say here. I followed your work since 2013, and your advice and books really helped me. And now I'm a PhD candidate with an academic star advisor. I know what that's like, Louise. Which barely has, I'm assuming, barely has time. I guess you mean who barely has time to actually advise. Do you have a word on how to optimize my work with him and take the most of his knowledge in minimum time? Yeah, I mean, okay. So if you're working with an academic star advisor, like this was my experience at MIT, there's very little, you know, let me talk to you about how to be a graduate student. How are you doing? Let me give you some advice. Here's what I recommend for you. You don't really get that with the star caliber types. What you really learn from them is you want to write papers with them and watch how they do it and be a part of it. Like the biggest thing you're going to learn, especially if you're looking towards a academic career, which I assume you might be if you're studying under a star, the biggest thing you can learn is what actually goes into producing a top quality paper of the type stars produce. How early do they start? How hard do they work? How do they set their sights? How do they figure things out? And be useful, be dependable, be indispensable. I'll do this piece of it. You get it done. And you just learn by being a part of it. Like literally the metric you should be tracking is like, how many papers can I co-author with my advisor in the next year, or the next 2 years? The knowledge will come from that, even if it's not explicitly taught to you. All right, let's see what else we have here. I'm looking as we wind down. As I said, I'm willing to do a few broader questions if you want to throw those in. Though we may have actually. I'm wondering if we've actually overflowed their Q&A capability here. It seems to have frozen out at 333 questions about 20 minutes ago. Oh no, here we go. They're loading now. Oh, I see. It was just slow. All right. Roberta asking, which book do you summarize your capture, configure, control system? That terminology comes from my podcast, actually. It's from Deep Questions. So I don't use that terminology in any particular book. Deep Work covers a bunch of those ideas. I mean, I talk about time block planning in there. How to become a straight A student, actually. I lay out a whole system for students in there, which is pretty similar. I mean, I talk about it's a little bit too restrictive for the working world. You have something like time blocking in there. You have something like weekly planning in there. So there's some interesting ideas covered in there. Is using Facebook as a marketing tool ethical? Well, there's a broad question. I typically draw the distinction. I think a lot of what Facebook does is borderline ethical. I tend to think it's hard to fault right now a business, especially a small business, for using it, because it is like a miracle for people trying to market. They have so much data on everybody that they can pinpoint market it. So I don't tend to blame marketers for using it. I think the approach that's going to destabilize the sort of what I feel to be negative hold that these platforms have on our culture is going to come from the user base leaving. So the user base leaving makes them less useful. I would like to see a future in which Facebook is not a useful tool to marketers, and that's why they not use it. I don't think the marketers themselves are going to be the force that's going to change things there. All right, here's an anonymous question. How long do you think it takes to recover from years of distracted, unfocused ways of working and procrastinating? 3 months. I would say about 3 months. You build up to a little bit gradually, but I mean, look, you build your first quarterly plans for those 3 months. They don't have to be great, but you have them. You do weekly planning, you do time blocking, you're doing capturing, you're doing configuring. So the things you capture, you actually think about and you look at, and you start tracking some metrics that matter. Do that for 3 months. Your life's going to feel completely different than if you're coming from a world of procrastination, if you're coming from a world of not getting things done. It doesn't take that long. When I used to advise students, when I was doing mainly student advice writing, and I would do a lot of advising to students in the Boston area when I was at MIT, we had like a one semester time frame for turning things around with students, and you could work miracles in a semester. Miranda asked, you plan to write a book on how to do top research like a star? No, it would be a short book. I mean, you got to learn from the best possible people, learn how they write papers, do that. No, the problem is that is really hard usually. It takes a ton of time. It takes a ton of will and discipline. But there's not a lot of magic. Like there's not a lot of technique magic to it, I would say. I mean, really star researchers are very smart people who trained under very smart people who came before them and are then doing what they learned in terms of how they write papers. Also, the market is small. Just a little insider writer thing. I mean, if you're writing that market would be too small, I think, for that'd be a very niche book. R1 tenure track bound graduate students is not a market that it's a market you could write for, but you're not going on the Today Show for that one. All right. Just a brief note. Chris asked about advice for homeschooling a 14-year-old boy, having a hard time keeping him on task. I mean, Chris, I'm not going to give you a useful answer. I'm just going to give you a psychological answer. Assuming that you're homeschooling the 14-year-old boy because the schools are temporarily closed, it is very useful just to keep in mind that from an education perspective, this is just a dumpster fire of a situation, and it's just terrible, and it will get better, but to go easy on yourself because there's no right way to do it. It's just untenable situation. So at least take comfort in the idea that it is temporary. Pandemics come, pandemics go. Throughout all of human history, this has been the case. This one is causing a lot of terrible situations, specifically when it comes to trying to juggle kids. Trust me, I have a bunch of them at home. And so, yeah, there are things you can do. I'm probably not the best expert on homeschooling, but that's the only psychological point I've been saying a lot on my podcast is it's okay to acknowledge that you're in London, it's the Blitz. And so not everything is going to get done the way that you might like in a normal time. All right, let's see here. Let's get a couple more questions in. Is there a podcast episode where I discuss strategic planning, particularly quarterly? Yeah, there's a bunch. Joe, look at the Habit Tune-Up mini episodes, and I get into it in a bunch of those. In the description of my episodes, I always list all the topics and the timestamps. So just look at the descriptions and you'll find it. That's a little bit niche. So Jill is asking about any books they can read about the deep life being an idea I talk a lot about on my podcast. One thing I would recommend is reading books about people who have lived deep lives. I think there's a lot to learn from actually just studying from a biography perspective, people who have lived lives that somehow resonate with you. And then you try to figure out, why did this resonate? And in trying to figure out, why does this resonate? Where did that moral intimation come from? You actually, from a reflective perspective, figure out more about what's important to you. And so become a biography reader. Sign up for, like a good piece of advice here, sign up for author Ryan Holiday's reading list newsletter. So a monthly newsletter about all the books he's read. And he's very heavy on historical and biographies. And so it's a great source of finding well-written biographies of deep lives. Not to keep plugging my podcast, but I interviewed him on a semi-recent episode of the podcast as well. And we talked about, among other things, how does he find time to read that many books? And I'll give you the short answer. He says it's really like an hour to an hour and a half a day on average, done consistently with strategic skimming. When, certain types of books, you've seen this before, you're trying to find what's new. that's enough to get to these sort of Herculean monthly reading lists that he's able to write about. All right, we're at 4. Let's see if we do one more question, and then we need to wind this down. Just looking around here. All right, what's my final question going to be? This is the question. A lot of people are asking about getting a link to this recording that will be available. Right. Yes, Kyle says, at least I have my next batch of questions for the next several podcasts. Kyle, that's true. But that's not my problem. My problem is I have too many questions already for the podcast. That's why it takes me so long to ask for new questions for the podcast, is every time I ask, I get 600 to 800 questions in, and I only go through so many. And I don't want to skip them, but then they become less and less timely. And anyway, it's a whole other issue. All right. How do you, let's end with, how do you recharge when you feel burnt out or overwhelmed? I think that's maybe a good question to end on, because again, time blocking is intense. So what do you do outside of that time blocking time? And the short answer I'm going to give here is that when it comes to recharging, resist the instinct that says that the key to recharging is lack of activity, which is a storyline we tell ourselves, is that what we crave when we're feeling overwhelmed, like having lots of things to do and our schedule's very structured, is what we claim as having nothing to do. That if we go to the opposite of the thing that's causing us stress will cause us the most relief. Not really true. Not really true. We do need rest in the sense of sleep, and we do need variety of activity. If you do the same activity in all your waking hours, that is very numbing. And there's only so much incredibly intense intellectual concentration we can do, because that's a unnatural act for our species. And so, yeah, full out thinking as hard as you can, there's only so much you can do. But beyond that, activity is good. Meaningful activity is good. Intentional activity is good. And so this is one of the paradoxes that I keep coming across again and again when I work on the deep life and I work on productivity and I work on like high quality leisure, which I write about in Digital Minimalism, my book, is intentional, meaningful activity is more recharging than letting the Netflix autoplay do its work for an evening, even though it doesn't feel like that at the time. Even though it feels like at the time, like I don't want to go on this walk and then work on this project and then call this person who's important to me and then like make a cup of tea and read this book and take some notes in my notebook. That sounds like work. And I'd rather just, let's let the phone rock and roll. Let's let some algorithm select things that's going to tickle my brainstem. But the meaningful activity actually can be more recharging than no activity at all. So that's just a final piece of advice I will leave. In Digital Minimalism, I talk about Arnold Bennett's How to Live on 24 Hours a Day, one of the first self-help books ever written. It was published in the early 20th century. And this was one of his core points, is that even back then, he said, we suffer from this mythology that we need sort of lack of activity in order to recharge, but we don't. We need sleep, and outside of sleep, the more we're doing things that matter, the more we're going to feel like our life actually matters. So I think that's a good place to end, because it's a good countervailing force to the intense productivity that you'll get out of the time block planner. Work intensely when you're working, live intensely when you're not working. I think that is a deep combination. And with that, I want to thank everyone for attending. It looks like we got up to 700, closer to 800 at our peak here, and there's another 1,000 more people who registered to get the link. So I'm honored you bought the planner. I'm honored you came. I appreciate the questions. Keep them coming. Read the blog, listen to the podcast. I talk about this stuff all the time. Keep an eye on the books, but in the meantime, keep time blocking. And as I like to end each of my podcasts saying, stay deep.